for joining. My name is Dr. JP Sanchez, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as your Interim Executive Diversity Officer at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, as well as the Executive Associate Vice Chancellor within the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at University of New Mexico. So thank you so much for joining us today as we celebrate the legacy and the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today is not only an opportunity to learn from a nationally recognized champion and leader of medical education, but for Dr. Monica Lypson to help us think about what actionable items we can undertake to reduce the frequency and burden of racism within our academic health centers, with a particular lens in her sharing her own journey and what experiences she's learned about in mentoring faculty. I'm just going to share a little bit of Dr. Lypson and her many accomplishments. So Dr. Monica Lypson serves as the Vice Chair for Faculty Affairs and the Division Director of General Internal Medicine at the George Washington Medical Faculty Associates. She is a professor at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. In her role, Dr. Lypson provides visionary leadership for a diverse group of faculty involved in educational and patient care innovation, research, and community outreach. As Vice Chair, she is committed to creating and supporting the academic careers of all faculty members in the department. Recently, she was appointed as one of the associate editors for the Journal of Academic Medicine. And some of you may know that the Journal of Academic Medicine is one of the 2 peer-reviewed journals of the Association of American Medical Colleges, as well as the journal with the highest impact factor of any medical education journal. Within that journal, she recently co-authored an article entitled "Learning from the Past and Working in the Present to Create an Anti-Racist Future for Academic Medicine." Mr. Kendall has sent this out to all of you, so it is an important read, not only for today, but as we consider what we need to do as an institution moving forward. On a personal level, I just want to share, I have witnessed Dr. Lypson in many meetings. She's a staunch, direct, effective leader in advocating for and moving forward the needle on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and your openness and willingness to help guide us. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Lypson.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sanchez. It's a delight to be here. And as all things Zoom, school will get out in my house in a few minutes, so I cannot be responsible for what might happen in the background. But I am delighted to be here with you all today. And just let me know if you can see my slides. Great. And Dr. Sanchez gave me a tall task. I'm not 100% sure I can live up to it, but I was hoping to give you a little bit of an insight on sort of how my brain sort of thinks about these, why both education and issues around diversity and inclusion for me go hand in hand. And really sort of looking and thinking about leadership. I think a lot about Dr. King from the perspective of what makes a good leader. And we'll go from there. So we'll get started. I have no clear disclosures. My husband, if you've seen New England Journal this week, my husband runs the sickle cell program at Children's National, has been quite active on several gene trials in sickle cell, so he has a few disclosures. JP noted I'm the associate editor for academic medicine. I'm also the president-elect for the Society of General Internal Medicine. But I come to you with a bias as an African-American woman, a wife, and a healthcare professional. Those things all color what I have to say today. We'll try to talk about why we all sort of stick around And then I'll give you a little perspective about how we got to our editorial. And Dr. Sanchez was quite demure. He was actually a quite active member of the writing team and co-author. And we'll talk about some toolbox. And then I hope to leave a lot of time for questions and dialogue as we go along. Just a little bit about me. This is a picture of me and my son at the African American History Museum, going back, looking at the census tract data. And I can fortunately or unfortunately get to the 1870 census on both sides of my both paternal and maternal grandparents. This is the my maternal side. I have to go back because I'm waiting for it to do it for free at the library when this COVID pandemic is. So that tells you a little bit about me and my background. Most of my family is from Chicago. I'm also a proud product of a pipeline program. I started in the Chicago area health medical careers program, and I started my career in medicine since really at the age of 12 in 7th grade. And I say that is when we think about why is it important for academic medical centers to really invest in the community, I was a product of that community. The more important thing that you might want to say as to why clusters and cohorting people is important is because I had 3 counselors that summer when I was 12. All 3 of them are up here in the corner, and I had, like any prepubescent girl, had a crush on all of them. Bill McDade, who's now the Chief Diversity Officer for the ACGME, was the counselor in that program. Eric Whitaker, the former Illinois Health Director, was the counselor that summer, and Fred Beavers, who heads the vascular surgery program here at the VA in DC. And I talk about that because it's really important for us to think about building human capital and networks. None of us had parents who were in the healthcare, in medicine. I think Eric's mom was a nurse. That was probably as close as we got. And then I went to St. Ignatius, and it was profound to me. It's a Jesuit education, and I bring that up because Dr. King went to BU. It's also known for its Jesuit education. I think the Jesuits are really not only instill a sense of purpose, men and women for others, but also an intellectual curiosity that is profound. I went on to Brown, and then I went to medical school at Case. And the important thing that I didn't tell you that I should is that my parents were school teachers and didn't allow teaching to be on the options for careers. So it's kind of funny that actually what I do every day is teach. I found a different way to do that. And when I was a medical student at Case Western, I realized we were lucky. We had 2 Black faculty, Jackson Wright and Janice Douglas. You might not know who they are, but you know everything about them. They are the 2 African-American researchers really responsible for a lot of the hypertension trials that had gone on from basically now. They were key members. And I remember thinking as a medical student how awful it was to be in a city like Cleveland, and in a whole 2.5-year period, I only had 2 lectures from African-American physicians. And that's what really spurred my interest into what this academic medicine was. The other thing is Monty Harris, who's here, who's an otolaryngologist, actually here in DC. He was, I was a first year, he was a 4th year. He went to Morehouse. My husband went to Morehouse. This will all come back to Dr. King. And he was the first African-American to be AOA at Case Western. And that was like the mid-90s. And when I saw him make AOA, I said, okay, this has got to be a racket, and I got to figure out how to do that. And that really is what it took. for me to decide to pursue that pathway of excellence. It really took me seeing myself in somebody else, and I was like, okay, well, if Monty can do it, I can do it. Monty went to Morehouse, my husband went to Morehouse, and I realized that their perspective and their thinking about excellence, Black excellence in particular, is very different, and that sort of rubbed off on ensuing me. I went on to the Brigham, and it was a very fascinating place to be. I have to say that my time at Harvard was the first time that I realized that I was just as good as everybody else. Maybe it's something about going, for the lack of a better word, to the top of the mountaintop, and then you realize everybody else's dysfunction, and you realize I actually deserve to be here, and I actually have something to contribute. And that, for me, was actually profound, because I stopped making excuses for a lot of internal excuses about what I could or could not do. And I was like, if these is what Harvard doctors look like, I can do this. I have a master's degree in education, and again, because I think excellence has to pursue some fundamental education behind it. It's also the path, if you look at many of the folks in the theology, this idea to be called to service, but also to back that up with a true education, similar to the Reverend Dr. King, where he went and got his PhD. And then I've had this variety of experiences, my long career at the University of Michigan, where I really learned how to be an academician. But then I had to have peer networks outside of academic medicine to sort of keep myself grounded. So the Society of General Internal Medicine is really important to me. There's a minorities in medicine group there that actually not only functions as a kind of faculty development group, but also as a support network when you're kind of like, is it me that's crazy? Is it the place that's crazy? Is it the person who is persecuting me? It's a nice time to have that sounding board. And I have to say, at various times, I got all three answers. Yes, it is you, Monica. Or no, that place is crazy. Or yes, that person is out to get you. You need to do something different. And so finding a place like that is, I think, really important for all of us who have careers in this thing called academic medicine. I spent time as a government worker. I left Michigan and went to work for the last administration for 2 years. I learned a lot about why educators need to be involved in policy, why we need to be on the Hill and be active. Every day that I was able to take care of veterans is a day of pure pleasure and pride, and I continue to kind of hold on to that. And then I have had opportunities to partake as a health innovator in the Aspen Institute. So I sit in a classroom with a bunch of venture capitalists, biotech people, some from government, some from academic medicine. And I realized that part of the problem in academic medicine is we need to actually see the world a little bit broader. And I have to say the Aspen Institute has been that glimpse for me. When I can kind of go, oh, I see the advantages of venture capital and understand that has been profound to my own learning. And then finally, as many, you can see what I do for a little bit of therapy. My family is one of those families that usually spends at least 2 or 3 trips a year in Orlando, worshiping at the foot of the mouse, and can't wait to get back there soon. So that's just a little bit about me. And then I want to frame that as to how I think about leadership, how some of the disciples of Martin Luther King have really informed that. And I want you to think about what kind of leadership paradigm are you willing to live with? What are you willing to live as you think about your careers? I take one that always looks at the assets. So I look at the assets that patients bring in, I look at the assets that faculty bring in, and then use that as a guiding force for either change or improvement, right? Improving your strengths is the best way to be a better leader. You want to make sure you don't have any fatal flaws, but me working on my deficiencies is probably not an effective use of my time at this point. I want to do things that get me out of trouble if I have some flaws like that, but in general, I should be focused on my strengths. And this is a way of thinking that I think is critical. It's one of those things that I really brought to and have sort of written about and really thought about in terms of veteran-centered education. The assets that veterans bring to the clinical encounter are all those things and their background. That's just an example. You could think about it when a learner comes in your room or interacts with you. What do they bring to you to actually improve? A patient sits in front of you. What assets does that patient have to really navigate their disease? That's probably the best indicator of how well they're doing. So I really sort of also think about teams and learning from teams and how teams learn and work with one another. I have a health professions bent, thinking about the whole team and not just from a physician-centered way. And so one vision that I always think about or I offer, for me, someone who's in education, I think about transformational education. This is Habermas, who is a Latin American sociologist and education person who really talks about transformational learning as a way to overcome oppression. And so transformational education is really the underpinning of cutting edge patient-centered care and provides environments for high impact clinical outcomes across all people. It's really for us right now in academic medicine to really think about that as we sort of encounter this pandemic that has disproportionately affected various communities of color and indigenous people. And one way that I think about this, again, I told you I married a Morehouse man. And if you marry a Morehouse man, they will never let you forget that that's where Martin Luther King went. Robert Franklin is a student of Martin Luther King. He's the 10th president of Morehouse College. Morehouse College is a predominantly African-American male college formed shortly thereafter the Civil War. And in his book that just came out this year in a fortuitous way, he talked about moral leadership in a time of reckoning. And he really studied the writings of Dr. King and others, thinking about how to think about leadership in a new paradigm. I'm going to talk about his book, but if you want to take another piece of this, if you just think about Jim Collins in Good to Great, and he talks about this level 5 leader, this is what we all should be striving for. Not many of us will get here. I have to say that, you know, if I'm on a good day, I'm a level 4 leader. I try to get to level 5, but that is hard. And a level 5 leader is one who has compelling modesty, quiet and calm determination. Those might seem like oxymorons, but you know, you can be aggressive and determined and calm and quiet. You channel your ambitions for the good of all and not necessarily for self. And then this is my favorite concept of the level 5 leader. It looks in the mirror and not in the window when failure arises. So what could I have done better? My team did well, but what did I do? And celebrating others is really important. And then this person acts like a catalyst. And the interesting thing, if you read Jim Collins, is really a lot of these people are introverts at baseline, which is not what we normally think about. So Franklin talks about students of a moral life. They frame issues in moral issues and communicate in ways that invite. So these days I use economic justice, equality, equity, justice. They live an exemplary life. and they're undaunted by failure. So kind of knock you down, you get back up and you keep cruising. You always are looking to be better. You invest in the next generation by building enduring institutions and concepts. Think about Dr. Sanchez and BYAP. And having done their best, they aim to teach people how to die a good death. That might seem a little morbid, but you know, when I am now in the place of counseling faculty, I talk about, what do you want your eulogy to say? We focused a lot on what your resume and your CV might say, but really, if you're thinking about this, what does the eulogy say? What do you want people to say? You want to be able to ask grand questions, address the public at large, not just your tribe. It's easy for me to talk to people who believe in the concepts I believe. What I really need to do is reach out beyond that audience. You communicate in short form, i.e. clarity of purpose, and you catalyze for ethical action. So to do something different. And I have spent the last week sort of embedded in this kind of Morehouse thought, because in full disclosure, my husband was roommates with Raphael Warnock at Morehouse. And so it's been a jubilant couple of weeks for us to really celebrate what it means to be in a learning environment. Think about what that learning environment must have been for them their first year there at Morehouse, to be steeped in this tradition of ways of thinking. But we all have threats, and now I'm gonna, in the next 10 minutes before I open up for questions, kind of take you through, that's where we wanna be, but in frank honesty, I'm not always there. And then how your career in academics and how academics needs to help us get there. So I'm assuming everybody knows about stereotype threat. So this is this classic concept. If you give a bunch of kids a test, they'll take the test, they'll do well. If you go in the room and say, well, women don't typically do well on that test, the women will actually prove you right. And actually there'll be a decrement in the scores. This happens across gender. At times it happens across race and ethnicity. And so stereotype threat is real. And I have to tell you about one that sits with me every single day. Well, not probably every day now, but when I went to Brown, I had to go to the remedial writing course, kind of English 101. So Brown is a place where you don't have to take any requirements, except for the people who have to take the requirement of intro English. I was one of those people. And from that day on, I worried about my writing. And this comes to play as you think about, well, how did you become an editor of a medical journal if all you do is worry about your writing? Well, I still do worry about my writing. This is my first paper, and it's nice to see Dr. Sanchez lived my dream, right? So my first paper was on the warning signs of declining faculty diversity, looking at the 80s and 90s and what was happening to people of color, faculty of color, were they even going into medicine? And basically showed that about 17 to 20% of white medical students would end up going in academic medicine, compared to about 12% of underrepresented minorities, and compared to 73% of Asian students. So this really idea that people weren't leaving medicine, they were graduating from medical school, but they weren't going into academic medicine, was actually real. And so I've spent a career sort of writing and thinking about these things in terms of education. And then when you come out on the other side, you start thinking about editorials. And then you say, why do people write editorials? We've been thinking a lot about that, right? Because editorials now is a place where in the newspaper, we worry about, are people reading the news or editorial or opinion? But I would like to say that there's a magic of editorials. Editorials are an important element of scientific journals and also newspapers and journalism, because editorials help give you a logical framework to think about scholarship. It helps you put into place scientific advances, and appreciation of clinical research and policy issues. That's the more lofty way to think about it. I like this one. A good editorial should express opinion without being opinionated. It should teach without being pedagogic. It should transform without being evangelical. It should engulf without drowning. It should motivate without making you feel dictatorial. And it should enlighten you without being dogmatic and prejudiced. That's what an editorial should get you thinking about something new in a way that you've never thought about it before. And in academic medicine, most journals in academic medicine usually leads with this editorial that sort of puts into play all of the articles that you're going to read for the rest of the journal, or there's a topic burning in academic medicine that needs to be written about, and our editor, Laura Roberts, will actually write this editorial. However, they were writing a supplement for academic medicine. The Josiah Macy Foundation put together a supplement in December on addressing harmful bias and eliminating discrimination in health profession learning environments. This was put in place after a meeting by the Josiah Macy Foundation. And given the events of the pandemic, the events of social unrest and the cry out for justice this summer, there was really a need for the journal to address what was happening from the perspective of academic medicine. And so the editorial board, and you can look, this is the entire editorial board as it was in June of 2020. Laura Roberts decided to give up the mic and asked who wanted to write about this issue around justice and equity and the lack thereof in academic medicine. And interesting enough, really called out to those who had been historically underrepresented among faculty in academic medicine, who came together to really start to say, let's think a different way about what is the issue in academic medicine. Are we in academic medicine confronting the same things that the public is confronting? And it was a resounding yes. We didn't think that academic medicine was any different. And so we really sort of took time to write this editorial that JP talked about a little bit. So back to the stereotype thread. I told you, like, this is somebody, every time I sit down to write a paper, I think about having to take that course again at Brown. I literally do. And that's 118 publications later. That's despite, you know, being able to search my name. It's nice to have a last name that you can just search your name, and all those articles actually do belong to me in PubMed. And, you know, my next goal is 93 now. You know, my next goal is I need that number to be 100. But I still think about that voice about I can't write. I have realized that there are these people called editors, and that's why they get paid for what they do. And they fix the problem that I have, which is often about a period in the right place or a capitalization in the wrong place. It's not that I can't write. Right? I need some help with style. I've come to that conclusion. And now the journal, this is what it's going to look like. So we want you to read. Laura sends her best and was happy that we would be talking about this. But this is a little bit, the reason this is important is because this is actually one of those carrots that you have to have in academic medicine, right? It's the publication, it's the peer review piece. The reason why I am an associate editor, because it's part of my therapy to get over that stereotype threat. I can do this. And if I'm not there, who else is going to be there to really speak from the perspective that I can have to offer as we decide about what papers are going to be published and to give a feedback. So that's why I participate on the editorial team. It's a lot of work, but it's important for me to sort of really be a voice there with the other members of the team to sort of say, are we really picking the right papers at the right time on the right topics? So I'm just going to give you in the next 5 minutes a little brief overview of the paper itself. I hope you all had a chance to read. And in full disclosure, it's actually, we've gotten a lot of, nice press and a lot of positive feedback about this article. It's a little disappointing to me, quite frankly, because there's nothing in this article that's new. There's nothing in this article that's novel. I think we put it all together, again, in a way, the editorial should be putting together in a way that you could digest it, you could read it, and you could take it on and move on. So we talk, quite frankly, about racism, and we call it out. Kamara Jones often talks about the ways that one can be racist. It involves the personal, the institution, the interpersonal, and the structure. In our article, we really wanted to talk about the institutional and the structure, i.e. academic medicine. Institution is the policy and practices across in institutions that put certain racial groups to disadvantage. Structure is really around the public policies or those institutional policies that go across institutions that perpetrate inequality. And so I proposed that, and the team proposed that academic medicine is a societal structure that promotes excellence in medicine that historically ensures entrenchment of systemic racism. It doesn't bring me joy to talk about that because I am a big believer in academic medicine, but that is part of the history that I bring when I participate in this system. We use the concept of violence because we thought, given the events of this summer, it wasn't that violence all of a sudden happened this summer. It was just the fact that people actually saw it through a new lens, I think. The violence is an extremely powerful force that causes damage. And we talked about the individual violence. So it's funny to see, I live in Maryland, I work in DC. The violence at the Capitol and the response to that violence versus the response in 2013 when a woman who was mentally ill was shot to death because she was trying to drive her car onto the Capitol steps. So, who gets the benefit of the doubt is a question that we must ask. Or individual events. Jacob Bick, the Black man shot in his back as he was walking away from the police. That story is not a news story, but I do say that he was handcuffed to his hospital bed at one of our academic peers, right? So the docs in the system didn't feel comfortable challenging this. Was he even under arrest such that he needed to be in handcuffs when he was paralyzed? Or structural violence. I lived in Michigan through the continued Flint water crisis, and that structural violence precludes Black people from achieving basic needs. This is just last week where the former Snyder was again charged with a misdemeanor against this. This is my favorite paper in academic medicine. We talk about structural violence. When we talk about social determinants, I'd like you to think about the violence that often is in place as we think about how the judiciary system affects health. How does the living conditions or environmental disparities affect health? Those are the things that we need to think about. And then we put forth this concept of symbolic violence by Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, well known for his concepts of violence is wielded with the tacit complicity of the victim and its agent, and both remain unconscious but submitting and willing to it. So these are the things that I think happen more in academic medicine. This is my fast food burgers fuel obesity risk in African Americans. So it's it's my fault that the McDonald's is on the corner and I eat there. No one's thinking about the cost of food, zoning policy. Is it cheaper to go to McDonald's than it is to buy fresh fruits and vegetables? All of those things, and I work 2 jobs. All of those things go into the obesity impact that have little to do with an individual. And so in our article, we talked about symbolic violence as an exercise of power that confers legitimacy and truth in certain ways of seeing, being, and acting. The differences in health outcomes often attributed to biology. And we know race is not a biological construct, it's a social phenomenon. Makes those with different social standings act as if this is a biologic fait accompli. And then we talk about this idea that by complicity, we mean that we operate in a society that fails to challenge why Black bodies' lives are less valuable than white bodies' lives. And we want to unpack that a little bit. So in JAMA this summer, I'm a big fan of educational innovation, and we think about Flexner, which is how we got this 2+2 curriculum in medical schools. The problem with Flexner is he closed most of the women and historically Black colleges, medical colleges, back at the turn of the last century. And so this is an article that came out this summer, Campbell et al. Said that if those four or five schools hadn't closed, we would have had another about 30,000 Black medical school graduates over the course of 100 years. And then we all know and deal with sort of microaggressions and sometimes overt racism. And faculty and students are constantly navigating and deciding when to point out injustice and when to not to. And here, just now, unfortunately, we lost Dr. Moore, and she called it out from her hospital bed, where she said, I wonder if this would happen if I was white. And then even in the response of the academic institution, good thing IU called for an external review, but even in the wording, you know, the nursing team might have been intimidated by her. Unpacking that and not realizing that those terms are filled with lots of stereotypes is problematic. And as we think about faculty, we know these numbers. I'm using Black here because that's what we were writing over the summer, but in no way mean to not share that oppression is happening to many of us across all races and creed and genders. And so, you know, 5% of physicians are Black, but only, you know, 3.5% to 4% make it to faculty. So again, the leaky pipeline in terms of academic medicine. There's the classic Brown tax of, you know, people live their lives there on your right. And, you know, you have a family, you go to work, you retire, you can publish your papers and do your research. For many of us of color, it's I go to work, I have my family, I have lots of family, right? I help support my mother and others in my family. I help support my community. I'm asked to sit on multiple communities. I have more debt than when I went to medical school. There's a lot of issues that really sort of play out here that attribute to the Brown tax that is not accounted for in the P&T committee when time comes. So a path forward is this concept of holistic review. The individual, this idea of, you know, people kind of poo-pooed this over the summer. And I have to say, I think we all need to do individual work. Even I need to do the individual work to be a better ally, to be a better advocate, to be a better coach. That is real work, and we should not discount that. There are structural issues. I gave you an asset-based framework to think about this. Educational advocacy, you know, my big thing is we should support our own employees across all levels. Talk about an underrepresented class. If we just supported the MAs and the environmental staff in terms of their education and their professional development, we would actually help our own environments. We could think about our rankings, health equity versus institutional diversity. And then academic medicine, you know, we really called for in our paper, we want people to apologize for what happened. What what happens in an academic medical facility. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Indiana. Using the tools that we know work, implementation science, quality improvement to make things better, and then actionable amends for historical injustices. I gave you a whole litany. I have one of those pedigrees that I would love to allow my children to benefit from that. But if I really wanted to fix the system, my children cannot benefit from that legacy, right? That everybody should start at the same sort of playing field. So recruitment and retention is kind of a classic place that we think about in academic medicine. There's ways to do that. I can tell you, Society of General Internal Medicine, one of the ways we do that is we're intentional about the award process. We have a committee that really just focuses on how do we get people who are historically underrepresented nominated for awards. That is the whole goal of the committee. Because we realize that that is a disadvantager within our environments. Having a standing structural for all appointments, you're gonna hire a hospice, you're gonna hire a nighttime shift ER doc, it should go to a standing search committee with standing standardized practices, because that's the way to decrease the amount of discrimination that happens in those procedures. And then retaining us. We know women and minorities leave a year before they actually leave. They have checked out. They have said, so there's no like counteroffer for women and minorities. This is played out in study after study after study. They've decided to leave a year ago. And the problem is no one addressed all these other things, the environmental, cultural, the professional development, all the things that led up to that year before they decided to leave. Those are the things we need to do. So I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than I promised, but I'm happy to open for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lypson. And there's a number of questions and comments. I'm going to ask our Dean McGrew if she can start us off. Dean McGrew. Okay. While we're trying to make, maybe look into the unmuting. I'm sorry, Dr. Lypson.
Oh, so yeah, and I see some of the questions. I can just start answering. Would that help?
Okay, yeah.
Oh, so I see the question about environmental sources of disease and medical. So the reason I like interprofessional education and IPE and have really crossed across disciplines is because I think those of us who have a diversity landscape do very well in those environments. So I think, so environmental injustice is one of the classic cases. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I can tell you where all of the waste funds are because they're all in Black and Latino communities on the south side of Chicago. That's where the dumping is, right? And it was only until the late 80s where people got more active about environmental justice and dumping, because those are also the places where you see higher rates of asthma, you see higher rates of breast cancer, you see higher rates. So we really need to reach out to all disciplines. And I think those of us in diversity, because we know how to do that. We know how to bring the sociologists to the table without showing our power, which we have in medicine. We know how to make that a comfortable conversation. So I would use that. I totally agree. We need to bring those topics into medicine, and we need to show our learners that those folks have expertise that we need to learn from. And then the Brown tax, let me hold on. I think some of it is we need to work. So I work in faculty affairs, and some of it is I've started to articulate, well, okay, how do we actually account for community activity in the promotion and tenure process? So here, sometimes I can't be as radical as others, but I can figure out how to change the system internally. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is, okay, we know that those historically underrepresented typically do a lot in the community. So how do I make a portfolio that shows that? How do I actually show a P&T community that that's important? Because, and the reason this is important is because the university is going to brag about it anyway, right? So the fact is the university is using you. I can say that GW was very active in Moderna. It's because we have a really good relationship with our community. Our ID docs have actually always been in the community, specifically around HIV. And so it was actually pretty easy, I use those terms relative, to get a more diverse patient population to enroll. But the university was just as happy to brag about that on the news and the Washington Post. So why can't we use that as part of the P&T? So those are the kind of things that need to happen. And I think we have talked about some of the accreditation standards changing to validate some of those, as Dr. Sanchez talks about. So, right, so when the ACGME said, as part of the QI, that we want you to look at disparities, all of a sudden everybody seemed to either figure out that maybe influenza vaccination is different across different populations in our own backyard, those kind of things.
I want to thank you, Dr. Lypson. Dean McGrew we were able to unmute her. Dean McGrew.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Dr. Lypson. This was fantastic, and I just want to express my appreciation for you being here. Laura Roberts is a friend of mine from way back, and so I'm excited to hear that. You know, I went to a leadership event one time, and they divided us into groups by our Myers-Briggs types. And of course, they divided us into ones where the ENTJs were predicted to be the greatest leaders. And in fact, those are the leaders that most of the majority leaders are part of. And for those of us who are introverts, which nobody on this phone can believe I am, but I'm an introvert.
I am too, so I get it.
I'm an expressive introvert. But, you know, I think there are great things like Dr. Sanchez's program, BenGap, that prepares leaders for the future. But I guess what I want to say is we can't prepare leaders for in the traditional leadership paradigm. And so as we prepare leaders for the future, it has to include the richness of all the leaders now, not just that traditional look at leadership. And so I am curious to hear from you how you think we change that paradigm of leadership so that we're not only preparing leaders, but preparing leaders that are ready for that, where we appreciate the best practices of diverse leadership.
Yeah. So this is why I bring up Good to Great. Yep. Because and for those who are Good to Great is like the consummate go-to leadership book, right? How do you get to be a level 5 leader? Actually, if you read that book, out of the 20 companies or so, like 18 of them had introverts as leaders.
Yes.
Like, actually, if you actually read the book, don't skim it, actually read it. It actually talks about all those skill sets you just talked about, right? The real active leaders. And in fact, it is the gregarious extrovert that often will get companies into trouble, right? Because it's all about ego and not about sort of selflessness. So one is actually just showing people the facts. And the facts are about the outcomes, and best leaders actually show their team before they show themselves, right? So when we think about magnanimous leaders, we often think about the showboats, for lack of a better word, but the people who are actually most effective are the people who are team-based. And I think those of us who have been historically marginalized actually already know that, right? Because the only way that we've been able to be successful is on the backs of others and with the support of others, and I think are more in tune to do that naturally. And some of it is, that's where the sponsorship is. It's not necessarily we have to teach it, because I think in many cases, our students and learners, residents and fellows bring it to the table. What we need to do is get other people to acknowledge the skill set.
Dr. Lypson, it's always been my contention that you have made it to the pinnacle of a career when the careers and the praises go to others and not yourself. I think, you know, we see that continuously. So it really is about that sponsorship. So thank you again so much. And thank you for introducing us to this new book, Moral Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean McGrew. I believe, Dr. Lypson, there's been several questions and comments around taxation, whether framed as minority tax, brown tax. If you could, once again, talk a little bit more about that. I think Michelle Osmond says, my tax question is how to make sure we don't expect too much from URM and service at the university. I worry about taxation a lot, particularly in the context of the school asking URMs who are in short supply to be highly involved in so many committees. How do we balance?
I think that's I'm pausing because I have two parts of that question, right? So there are two problems. There's the problem we create ourselves, which has to be dealt with a different way. And the problem we create ourselves are, I feel guilty, I need to help everybody, so I'm gonna say yes. How we deal with that is actually somewhat different than how we deal with the system always asking. And I would say they're different. So sometimes it's having a sponsor who is willing to actually say, no, what's really important to you? Pick the one or two things you really want to do and say no. And I have to say that takes time. I'm finally at the point where I actually can say no and not even feel bad about it. I'm like, no, I don't have time to sit on random committee that's not going to do, you know, I can recognize when I'm the token. I better recognize when I'm a token and I can say no. On the other hand, I can say it's really important for me to be there, and I can put bar rails. I'm happy to participate on your committee, but I can't do X, Y, and Z, or I'm happy to do that. So I think working on people's inner voice about not feeling so guilty about having to do it, but also getting sponsors in the system to say, and look across, like if you're starting to see that same person over and over again on the same committee, maybe there's a problem. It's not the problem of the person, it's a problem of the numbers. And I think that's where some near peer work needs to be done, because sometimes you can't see it yourself. It does take others to say, you know, you need to, you know, the classic case, you need to stop working on your work with the committees if you want to get promoted. Right? Sometimes that's a real frank conversation that people have to have. And people will make, and I think sometimes when you make that conversation frank, people will make different decisions. Some people will say, the promotion is not that important. And some people will say, yep, I'm gonna put that to the side or figure out a way to get to it. But I guess I separate those two. I don't have a great answer for the internal conflict, except for really working through that, usually with a peer. And the external is really working on the systems. You know, I gave up the multicultural curriculum at Michigan, to give you an example, and my whole goal was to find a white man who would lead that effort. And the reason is because, believe it or not, when he took over, he didn't have all the guilt, he didn't feel all the same, but he believed in the concepts, and that was what was important to go. So sometimes we too have to think outside our box about who else can do this work, and share that load, because it can be burdensome.
Excellent. There's one other question. I'm not sure if you can see it, by NL Shane. So I'm just going to read it. A few years ago, we did a series of focus groups with medical students about mistreatment related to race and ethnicity. We collected many touching and would have been instructive example stories about micro and macroaggressions. The participating students, however, disallowed the stories to be shared because of the possibility of being identified and receiving backlash down the road. What and how do we need to put into place for students to be and feel safe from retaliation?
That takes whole system change. And I think there are times, so there are two conversations there. Again, similar to the other one, there are times where you're going to have to decide, am I willing to take it for the greater good? If there's retaliation, I'm willing to take it because it's only in me being public about my issue that will fix it for other people. Sometimes that is the real decision. And no matter what everybody says, oh no, they're not going to retaliate. No, nope. What you need to do is help that learner realize that there might be retaliation and here's how we're going to deal with that. That's the resiliency, unfortunately, of those who have been oppressed, right? That is part of our resiliency. The other part is, why is it that they feel that way? Sometimes it's real and sometimes it's imagined. And I'm okay with the real. I am not okay with the imagined, and that's where we need to work, right? That's where we need to work as educators around surgical subspecialties, right? You're worried because you won't get matched into orthopedics. Is that real or is that imagined? Because I'm thinking about how many orthopedic residency program directors that are looking for excellent underrepresented minorities to participate. So I can help you navigate that. So I think sometimes it's a both and we need to change our systems. I worry about retaliation. So they're not crazy. Like, that's the other thing to tell the students are not crazy. They wouldn't come up with these thoughts if somebody didn't have an experience.
So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Lypson, for joining us as a part of Martin Luther King Jr. Week, but more importantly, for sharing your lived experiences and helping us think about some actionable items, including potentially our next book club. So thank you again, and thank you for all the participants in joining us today. Special thanks to Mr. Kendall, our Dean McGrew, for supporting and advocating for these sessions to occur this week. Important final reminder. The DEI committee of the medical school nominated 2 speakers, Dr. Lypson being one of them, and Dr. Culbreth. We have moved Dr. Culbreth's session to next Thursday between 12 and 1 because this past week, President Stokes was speaking during that time. So please join us in our continuation of discussing these topics next Thursday, 12 to 1 with Dr. Culbreth. Thank you so much, Dr. Lypson. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.